Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's Fireside Chat. My name is Tom Ancona, and I'm an Associate Director with the McKean Center for the Common Good here at Bowdoin.
Woo!
I'm so happy to see so many students, faculty, staff, and community members here that are as excited as I am to learn from and ask questions of Mónica Guzmán this evening. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you of the program for tonight. After these introductions, Professor Logan and Alondra will interview Mónica for a bit before we will open up the program to your questions. From a session we had with Mónica earlier today, I know she's willing and eager to engage with challenging questions about her work, her career, and the politicized climate we find ourselves in today. For that Q&A, you'll see that there are standing microphones here and here. If you could line up for those, that would be great. But if you're not comfortable with lining up, just raise your hand and I'll bring a microphone to you. After your great questions, we're going to be holding an informal dessert reception with Mónica across the street in Macmillan House that you are also welcome to attend. Thank you to Mac House for hosting.
Woo.
And with that, I'd like to briefly introduce our interviewers and Mónica. Barry Logan is the Samuel S. Butcher Professor in the Natural Sciences. Professor Logan examines plant responses to environmental stress with a particular interest in photosynthesis and mechanisms protecting leaves from intense light. He is also the Senior Faculty Fellow for the McKean Center for the Common Good. Lastly, and this does tell you how long he's been at Bowdoin, he had Mónica as a student.
That's right.
Our second interviewer is Alondra Romero. She is a member of the class of 2024 and a Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx studies major. She is passionate about politics, both here and in her home state of Georgia. I have the great fortune to be working with her this year on the McKean Center's What Matters programs, focused on making connections across political difference, including this program today. Last, and certainly not least, Mónica Guzmán is a bridge builder, journalist, and author who lives for great conversations sparked by curious questions. Her best-selling book, I Never Thought of It That Way, How to Have Fearlessly Curious Conversations in Dangerously Divided Times, was released in March 2022 and is excellent. A 2005 Bowdoin graduate, she's Senior Fellow for Public Practice at Braver Angels, the nation's largest cross-partisan grassroots organization working to depolarize America. She's the host of live interview series at Crosscut and the co-founder of the award-winning Seattle newspaper, The Evergrey. She was a 2019 fellow at the Henry M. Jackson Foundation, where she studied social and political division, and a 2016 fellow at the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University, where she researched how journalists can rethink their roles to better meet the needs of a participatory public. She was named one of the 50 most influential women in Seattle, served twice as a juror for the Pulitzer Prizes, and plays a barbarian named Shadrock in her Besties Dungeons & Dragons campaign.
It's the most important part.
Of course. A Mexican immigrant, Latina, and dual US-Mexican citizen, she lives in Seattle with her husband and 2 kids and is the proud liberal daughter of conservative parents. Before we get started, I'd like to thank a few people for helping to bring this event together. First, please thank President Clayton Rose for stepping up to support this program when we first suggested it to him almost 6 months ago. Second, I would like to thank Professor Tricia Welsh and Professor Dan Stone for raising the idea of bringing Mónica back to Bowdoin and helping steward us to tonight. I'm deeply appreciated to you both for that. Lastly, thanks to Mónica for taking the time to visit us, share her book with so many here on campus, and provide us with a great example of what Bowdoin graduates can accomplish. Please join me in welcoming Mónica back to Bowdoin. All right, and with that, I'll hand the program off to Alondra and Barry. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. Yeah, well, thank you so much for being here today. I really enjoyed reading your book, and I'm really excited to chat with you about the book and your Bowdoin experience and so much more. So many of us have read the book in the audience, but for those who haven't, I just wanted to ask if you could share a bit about why you were inspired to write the book and also why now.
Yeah, the why now. Yeah, we all sense the fundamental brokenness in the way that our society talks to itself about things that matter. Politics is everything. It's so high stakes. It's down to the level of the heart for many people, for many, many good reasons. It's the most important and one of the most difficult things to have productive conversations around. And the fact that it is so difficult is part of what seems to be an underlying problem underneath so many things that are so hard to solve. So that's the why now. The why this book and why me, there's two threads. One is my journalism. So right out of Bowdoin, I got a fellowship called the Hearst Newspapers Fellowship. I was a cops reporter at the Houston Chronicle. I was an education reporter at the Midland Daily News in Michigan, and then I ended up in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer in Seattle, Washington, and that was remarkable. And I just knew journalism was for me because I care so deeply about people understanding each other. Just all my life, it seemed like so much goes wrong when we don't. So let me see what I can do to try to help. And so for years, okay, I'm learning how to tell stories, I'm doing the best job that I can, I'm making mistakes, I'm learning, I'm trying to be responsible. But there did come a point where I thought, you know what, if my mission is to help people understand each other, there's so much fracture in the media landscape and in society in general that I don't think I'm actually fulfilling that mission just by continuing to do journalism. I need to do something else. So then comes the second thread, and that's my family. So I am the proud liberal daughter of conservative parents. I always listen for laughs on that line, and I got those tonight. But I am. My parents and I are Mexican immigrants, and we became citizens after many years of doing the things you gotta do and studying for the tests and all that in the year 2000. And it was pretty immediate. At that point, I came home and I plopped my backpack down in the office in my house, and I looked up and I saw a Bush Cheney sign over my mother's desk, and I was like, and it all kind of became clear, like all those dinner table conversations, they're Republicans and I'm Democrat. I didn't think it was gonna amount to that. And so, man, there's something about, for us, speaking Spanish. I grew up in New Hampshire, and no one around us really seemed to, I don't think a lot of people around us spoke Spanish, so we felt okay speaking at a very high animated volume about politics out at restaurants because no one could understand anyway. So we're just like, there's all kinds of fights about welfare and Glenn Beck and abortion and who knows what else. It got really tense around the 2016 presidential campaign. Things really changed. Even so, despite the anger and the yelling kind of being unprecedented, it still got to a point where I understood why my parents voted the way they did. They voted for Donald Trump both times. They'll probably vote for him again. It's an active conversation among us. And I did not. I voted for the Democratic candidates. And so comparing that experience to what I was hearing from and seeing all across the country with people burning bridges and ending relationships over politics at the extreme end, but at least feeling less and less seen by people close to them because politics was something they just couldn't. How do you even bring it up? It's gotten so bad and so bad. So both of those things, the journalism, the wanting people to understand each other, wanting to help, and this experience with my family giving me, a different lens than many folks that I knew in Seattle, just made me think I've got to try to step back and see if there's something else I can do to try to help with this underlying political polarization.
Yeah. I definitely want to circle back to the family aspect that you were mentioning, but to come back to Bowdoin a little bit, you mentioned that you were involved in journalism when you were at Bowdoin. I'd be curious to learn more about how your experiences here influenced your professional life and then also your book, and particularly the academic context of what you did academically that influenced you, but also just like the little things in between in the social life and how that grew into the themes that you have in your book right now.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a little bit just this week, knowing I was going to come back. Like, oh my gosh, it's been so long. Like, what seeds were planted way back then, right? And so among them, I majored in sociology and I minored in film studies. That's Trisha, that's right. And I'll start with film studies because even before I came here and studied film, my parents' honeymoon, they love to tell the story. They saw something like 5 movies in one day in their honeymoon. In like 1981, they just did it. And all my life when we were kids, we would just always see movies. And the reason that feels significant is because A good movie, you understand characters' motivations. If you don't know why someone did what they did, it doesn't add up and it's not very enjoyable. You're not connecting to the experience. And so movies, heroes, villains, dramas, comedies, you get to see the reasons why people do what they do, whether or not it's good or bad or destroys everything or it's a tragedy. And so that sort of planted, I think, a conviction that was emphasized in film studies here at Bowdoin, that everybody has their reasons. We may not know them, we may not accept them, we may not like them, but very few people do things senselessly, right? Not to them, anyway. So that really stuck with me. I was at the Bowdoin Orient. I was the opinion editor of the school paper and then senior editor my senior year. And I remember, first of all, I don't know how it works now, but back then, it was Thursday night was just given over to the Orient. Raise your hand if you're involved with the Orient in any way. Some people involved. That's awesome. Okay, great. So yeah, we would just be there at the Orient building, which I need to visit. I slept in there many Thursday nights. But we would just argue and debate whatever was in the opinion pages. We had to write our editorials, and often it was that night when we wrote the editorials. So what was it going to be about? Do we even agree? And so it was, it could get pretty contentious. So I remember that really clearly. And then the last thing I'll mention academically is sociology. Sociology and journalism went hand in hand for me because it was about living life in the form of a question. Not just walking through the systems and the conventions of our society, but asking why they are. How did they come to be this way? Could they be different and better? And so getting that curiosity sparked here at Bowdoin was pretty excellent. Today, when I spoke with faculty over lunch, I remembered a moment, because I was asked to think back as well. Freshman year, I lived in Moore Hall, fourth floor Moore. And it was fantastic. And we would have, who's in Moore? Raise your hand. Yeah!
Holy moly.
Lots of people.
It was great. And we would have, there was one room at the far end with, the guys who just had a lot of debates. And just the more nights that we could go and just get into it, and there would be kind of crowds, and you would hear people coming up the stairs. And I think we would get a little louder, hoping that they'd come in and see what all the fuss was about. Door open, disagreement, just wild debate about who knows what, usually something in government or politics. And it was so fun, and it didn't matter that I had class early the next day. This was learning.
Wow.
Monica, thank you. I wanted to ask if you could explore what you share with your parents in terms of political viewpoints or viewpoints of other kinds. And I'm prompted to ask, because as you identify yourself as liberal child of conservative parents, there's a dichotomy there, right? And so each of you has to line up on one side of the room. And of course, your reference to your parents leaves me thinking about my father, who was a lifelong pro-union Democrat who probably didn't vote for a Democrat in his adult life, if that makes sense. The Irish Bostonian made sense to me in a way. And I think although our voting practices differed, our values didn't differ by that much. And I just wondered if you could comment on what you share with those conservative parents of yours and the ways in which liberal versus conservative doesn't do justice to your value systems and your beliefs.
Oh, there are so many ways that it doesn't do justice. The first thing that came to mind is my mother and I have a storied history around our differences in the issue of abortion. So my mother, Mexican Catholic, is its own kind of Catholic. And for my mom, life is so sacred. And for me, it is too. It really, really is. And yet we ended up on the two different sides of the abortion political debate. But I remember, when I think about that for us, I don't think about the arguments and the logic so much as scenes from our lives. I think about my mom. She worked at an abortion counseling clinic that would just talk to women who had just had abortions or were thinking about having abortions from a more Catholic perspective. But she would come home devastated, carrying the trauma of all these women that she met. And me and my brother didn't always know what to say to her when she came home. I remember the night when I told her, because I felt I had to, that, Mom, I'm pretty sure I'm pro-choice. And she cried, and trying to explain to her, I respect life, but But here's a different way that I see it, right? I'm thinking about the life of the woman, of the pregnant person, I suppose, and things like that. So I think about those scenes. She knows that I respect life, and we have had so many conversations about this, and I know that she respects choice. I do. One of the most fun conversations we had was sort of a science fiction conversation where we got kind of frustrated, like, why haven't we figured out, we have all this scientific technology, why haven't we figured out how a fetus can be viable somewhere other than a woman's body? Like, could that, you start getting creative when you see where you share things, and it gets maybe a little silly, but you can still kind of come together. But yeah, as far as the labels, when Roe was overturned earlier this year, she was the first person I called, and I knew that she'd be happy, and she was. But we ended up having a really good conversation about, Mom, I gotta tell you, like, I'm concerned about what this means as far as a precedent for gay rights and things like that. And she went, oh, I didn't think about it that way. I didn't even think that was potentially next, and we had a complicated conversation about it. So yeah, I think leaning on labels seems accurate so much of the time because our identities and our politics have become so stacked. And there's been a lot written about this. And so it seems like such a good predictor, but you miss the individual, you miss the person. And when the person doesn't feel heard, they can't hear. That's the main principle. People only hear when they're heard. And so the fewer of these kinds of conversations we have to understand where people actually are and why they believe what they believe, and one-on-one, the more that we just let our assumptions rule the day and that our projections of each other begin to become reality because we push each other off into those stereotypes.
Thank you. That gets us into your book naturally. And I'm sure among us we've got those who have read the book, those who are reading the book, those who have not yet read the book. I wonder if you have a way of bringing the book to your audience. I know it's lengthy enough. We're not going to read it page by page, but yeah. Can you help for people who may not have yet read the book to understand what your argument is?
Yeah, so in a quick summary, there's 5 parts of it. The first part is called the SOS, and that's the one that talks about how we got to where we are. And so the framework I use is SOS. It's the call for help. It's sorting, othering, and siloing. These 3 natural human tendencies that have made polarization really amplified in our world right now. And so sorting is the natural human tendency to want to be around people who are like us, especially in stressful times. You don't want to make your life less comfortable by being around people who are going to challenge everything you say. So, and we see it, blue zip codes getting bluer, red zip codes getting redder, but we know it kind of on a baseline human level even beyond that. Othering is the natural human tendency to put distance between ourselves and those we deem different. And some pretty chilling research going back decades shows that the difference doesn't even have to be that meaningful for us to begin to discriminate in subtle ways. When it is meaningful, it's really dangerous. And then siloing is mostly about, I don't have it, but it's about technology. It's about how we're able to put so much of what stimulates our thinking and where we put our attention into this device that's custom built for us. So we have the voices we tend to like, we have the filters we tend to like, the sources we tend to like, and we're all walking around with that in our pockets, often competing and winning against the world around us, against the spontaneous interactions we might otherwise have. So those silos tend to amplify things and then really dampen other things that keep us from seeing the world as it is. And my argument is that we are so divided, we're blinded. That we're, with all this distance and all this sorting and all this siloing means we're not even seeing the world and its debates for what it really is. We're largely living in projections that tend to arrive to us via whatever vehicles or media or voices we tend to prefer. And this is happening all across. So that's part 1, but to quickly walk through the others. Part 2 is about curiosity. It's about perspective, and it's about the power of conversation. Conversation is this sophisticated set of skills that we take for granted. We hardly ever think about what a miracle it is. When you have a conversation with someone else, one-on-one, you're reading their voice, their tone, their gestures, if you happen to be in person. There's all these little signals, and we communicate meaning. It's remarkable, and we do it so powerfully, and sometimes wordlessly, and the power that conversation has. Curiosity, neurologically, it's a fairly young area of research, but it's the knowledge emotion. It's the craving for information. When we are curious, we're unstoppable because we sense a gap between what we know and what we want to know. And it's amazing how far we'll go to fill in that gap. And it turns out that curiosity is something you can aim at the things you don't understand. You can be intentional about it. So the book talks about how you can wield curiosity to fill in the blanks. And then we talk about assumptions. Assumptions are uncertainties that we make certain. And they'll come at us in our thoughts, and we won't think to question them. So the way to bring curiosity more into our lives so they can help us across these divides is to turn our judgments and our assumptions into questions. And that takes a certain amount of awareness, and I talk about how that works. Then I talk about paths. The best way to understand where people are is to understand where they've been and ask questions around where are you coming from. And so that means understanding their stories behind their opinions and perspectives. Like actually what have been their experiences? What path did they walk to arrive at this position on guns, at this position on immigration? Hearing people's stories is often a far more persuasive way to just understand, oh, that's what you mean. And we're not just stuck in syllogism. We're not just stuck in logic as if that's all there is. We're not robots, we're not. We're human beings. And then there's concerns and values. Values are so important. People often say, I can't talk to them, they don't share my values. But actually, they do share your values. They just stack them in a different order for different issues. And we can talk about some examples about that. And then finally, the book closes with a chapter on honesty and on openness. Because if you're curious, that's great. But if people aren't honest and open, what's the point? They're still guarded. They don't want to share with you what's really in their heart and what are we really learning. One of the ways in which we're so divided, we're blinded, is because even within our sides, we sort of all assume that we all agree and we all say the same things, and then we eliminate nuance, even within our political side or within our ideologies, and that's blinding too. So yeah, at the end of the day, it's about being curious. You cannot be curious and judgmental at the same time. These are two different modes. And you can actually turn your judgments into curiosity. Learn more, listen first, gather more stories, increase understanding so that your judgments can be less reckless and more informed. And so that hopefully we can make persuasion effective again in our society, because right now there is way too little trust for that to be the case.
Thank you so much for giving that synopsis of your book. Earlier, Barry and I were talking about how your book very much felt very actionable, and you had things that needed to change, but you also provided a way to make that change. And we were wondering why you decided to write it in that style. And how do you think that book has resonated with audiences in a different way than other styles have that are more just this is the problem?
Yeah, I was very intentionally tactical. And I think the reason is, in my journalism, I've really gravitated toward what's useful. We can have the conversations about the meaning of things and the analysis of things, but ultimately I think good journalism gives people the equipment. Like, what do they need to know, what choices they need to make, what's useful. So I wanted to be very direct on that. There's a lot of books that talk about the polarization we're in, that talk about the division we're in and analyze it, and they're great, and they've added a lot to the conversation. But I find that when people are themselves interested in this, it's often from a personal angle that might be tough to talk about. My grandmother, my daughter, my colleague. What do I do at work when these things come up? I don't know what to do with my team. So this comes up in people's lives on the one-to-one level and on the relationship level. So I want it to be useful there, because that's where I see the pain be really pronounced, for as much as we talk about, and we should, the institutions of media and politics being sort of toxic with polarization. That's true. But those two institutions are built to be mirrors of culture. And culture is all of us. So the one-to-one may seem small, but I think it's where it all begins and it all ends. It's the alpha and omega of all of it. So as far as reaction, it's interesting. I've done talks with the corporate world, like big insurance companies and things like that. And what's funny is even when they bring me in to talk about this stuff in a workplace context, like help us disagree better at work, right? You get to the Q&A and people come back to talking about their families. They come back to talking about their relationships. And it's, what do I do when? What do I do if? What if this person comes at me this way and that way and that way? And I think that's what people kind of crave, is like, we intuit that this is possible, but where's the decision tree? Where's the if this, then that? And that's what I wanted to, this feels like just a beginning, but that's what I want to unpack.
Yeah, thank you so much. And you mentioned that social media, the way social media is set up in a way to mirror culture. And I'm really glad that you brought up that point, because one of the things that I was thinking about when I was reading your book is how to embrace complexity, which is a common thing that you talk about in social media, which is set up to root yourselves in those silos that you mentioned earlier. And a follow-up question to that, I guess, would also be like the performative activism, or the activism that we've seen on platforms like Instagram and Twitter. Do you think that that actually does affect real change if those are kind of speaking to the silos? And how can we shift that to embrace complexity and curiosity?
Oh yeah, it's a great set of questions. I'll begin by saying that so much is about what internet and digital exchanges make visible and invisible. And it sort of boils down to the internet is a non-place that makes us into non-people. You see an avatar. Oftentimes on social media, people put right at the level of their name, my name or my handle, dash, my cause. So we billboard right at the level of identity where our opinions are. So that's one thing we do. It is very difficult, I think, on social media to remember. You don't get a lot of cues that there's a whole life and set of experiences and path that has been walked to whatever this person is choosing to share on social media as far as their perspective. So it's difficult to remember that that's something you can ask about, or that becomes kind of evidently interesting. Usually when we're in person, we want to know. Like, that's a little more of an organic curiosity. Like, oh, why do you believe that? Tell me more about that. How'd you come to that conclusion? And on the internet, it feels like one of the other things is we don't get to witness listening, right? You post something on social media, and you have, in a lot of cases, this invisible audience. You don't know how big, and you have no idea what they're thinking as they read what you say. No clue. So you get things like the Hawthorne effect, right, where you just kind of imagine the worst. And so you police yourself and you censor yourself to say the safest possible thing you can. But on the other hand, you're also very concerned with belonging. I mean, social media is a wonderful community building platform. It's so efficient at that. So you're also thinking, whatever I say, will it be approved by those with whom I feel I should belong? What will they do if I say the wrong thing? But again, we don't get to witness listening, so we start to believe absurdities. For example, I see this a lot with sort of memes, right? Where you see a meme or you see something that really cleverly encapsulates a reason that you believe what you believe for some political issue, be whatever it is. Like, here's the reason, it's glittering, it's gorgeous, and all I need to do is hand it over to that person, and they will agree with me. This will be glittering and gorgeous and compelling and convincing to them too. But that's not the case at all. We're not empty containers just waiting for some reason to drop in and change us. We're down to our roots. We have a whole lives. We see not with our eyes, but with our whole biographies. We have whole lives informing who we are. But on social media, often we hand that reason over. It doesn't have the desired effect, and we get angry. What do you mean? You don't agree? You must be an idiot. And then we think about that. People are either crazy, stupid, or evil. Those are the sort of three big untruths. So all of these things become easier traps to fall into when we don't have the full toolbox of human communication at our disposal. And maybe the most important piece of that is goodwill. It's like when you're in person, goodwill is communicated wordlessly. But on social media, you have to go out of your way to put it in words because people will misunderstand you. As far as the performative activism piece you were talking about, I think it comes down to this for me. Activism is really, really efficient on social media. I mean, you build up your armies, right, of people who believe in this cause and get the word out. The problem comes back to that fracturing. Because so many of these dynamics are contributing to an overall fracturing, even a movement or an activist-type cause that is really onto something just runs into walls with these other communities. Walls that we've almost resigned ourselves to. Half the country doesn't trust the media, a lot of journalists say. Oh, well. What do you mean, oh, well? How can journalism still be a democratic institution if half the country doesn't trust it? That doesn't work. So we can't give up on that. So we have to, I think that no matter who you are, you can be very partisan and activist and good for you, like we gotta fight for this stuff, but we've gotta devote some of our energies to repairing and maintaining that baseline trust across our whole society, or any movement that we want to build is going to run into those walls.
It feels to me like early days in social media, where it had profound impacts on social movements, it wasn't the arena where activism played out, but it was a tool that activists used in order to practice their activism in the streets, right? And so it is democratic in some ways when entrenched, powerful communication venues get shut down.
That's right.
And so that feels fundamentally different to me than, right, passing memes around on social media.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
And it feels like we've gone from those early days to a different moment. I don't know. I'd like to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to put it, that it was a tool of something. I mean, Arab Spring, if you all remember that, very optimistic, exciting moment, right, where we saw activists, all around the world using social media to subvert government barriers to change, and that was really awesome. But then what happened is, as sort of always happens, and this is sort of sociology, I suppose, but all these spaces eventually get populated with all the good and bad of humans, and the bad came too, right? Government censorship, really sophisticated censoring from all kinds of folks, misinformation, bad actors getting better at the game than anyone else. So I think we saw a lot of the excitement in the early days of social media because everyone hadn't arrived yet. And once everyone arrived, now it gets messy. Now we're really not so sure that it's a tool that's going to push us into the good. It turns out to be a tool that, like anything else, is going to hold our good and bad. And so then it calls on us to use it well and to not think that it is going to take care of justice for us,
Thanks. I wonder if we could explore a different domain of sociology. You raised the term. So, and what I'm interested in is your thoughts on the universality of this urge to be among people whose values we share. Mm-hmm. So the consensus, and it's early in your book, in the SOS section, this, which I read as sort of cast as human nature.
Yeah.
Well, then we all want to, we look in conversation, we look for points of agreement, we look for shared experience as a way to form a relationship. And so I'll raise a counterpoint to that, which I encountered while working in Australia at a university, and it was a mimeographed report of sociologist consultants that was delivered to the oil and gas industry. It was delivered to Esso, which is a big petrochemical company, and they, at the time, this was years and years ago, were doing exploration in Australia and finding that, and there are broad generalizations here, and so you'll have to forgive me for that, but Australians and Americans were not working together as well as they just naturally expected that they would. And this sociologist was arguing that, in fact, Australians, in formulating friendships, are looking for points of distinction, interesting areas to explore, whereas Americans are looking for common ground. So they enter into a potential relationship, and the American is searching for something to agree about, and the Australian is searching for something to disagree about.
So interesting.
And they walk away from each other because the American sees the Australian as aggressive and antagonistic, and the Australian sees the American as boring. And so that leaves me wondering then about the universality of this. Is it cultural or is it universal?
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I think just about everything is largely cultural. I mean, it's universal in that I do believe that there's a universal thing where, we all want to belong, we all want to matter, right? But what that means can change depending on where we are. There's some cultures that put family relationships in a really, really high place, and so you get a lot of meaning out of that, others that don't. Some more communal cultures, some more individualistic cultures. I mean, it's awesome. You get this wide spectrum. But I do think that the core truth is that we do all want to belong and we do all want to matter. It's just how and all of that. And so we'll find the clashes there. And yeah, the cultural clashes are really, really interesting. So I find that just something that I would want to ask more questions about, because that's a fascinating example. It's really neat.
Yeah, I mean, as you're talking, I feel like there are different notions of justice and values even across cultures too, right? That are both opportunities to explore. But potential differences.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, maybe we should all be a little more Australian. I don't know. It sounds kind of tempting. It's kind of cool.
Or, well, if not more Australian, at least aware that we exist in a culture, right? That in some ways guides the ways that we interact. We feel like we're in possession of free will and make these choices, and we do to some degree, but we do so in the environments in which we live and have been raised. So.
Yeah. Another question I had when reading your book is, of course, like having these conversations is really important, but to what extent would you say we are obliged to love our enemy, especially if it's at the expense of your well-being or at the expense of maybe that person has hurt you or has, pushed a limit?
Yeah.
And at what point should we keep going and trying these tactics that you illustrate in the book?
I mean, I think it's telling that you begin with love your enemy, because that comes from a spiritual tradition. I find that some of the best language about persistence in the face of pain comes from the spiritual traditions. Coming back to something less spiritual, I really, really do believe that there is no sense in thinking that anyone other than you can decide what divide you want to cross, what conversation you want to have, with whom, over what, and when. I don't think we can even really invite people into that, in a pressured way. We don't know who they are. We don't know where they come from. There's all kinds of clashes and internal conflicts and a lot of interactions where it's not just a disagreement. It's this person doesn't accept me. This is not just politics. This is who I am. And their political opinion is negating that key part of me. I have to share this story. I was interviewed by a podcast with a conservative host not that long ago, and she was setting up a question, and she said, Monica, well, let's say that you're, if there's a grown person and they're talking with their recently radicalized daughter, she said, and she's like, I know you're liberal. You probably wouldn't want me using that label, recently radicalized. And in my head, I thought, what does she mean by recently radicalized? Turned out what she meant was, it wasn't even the content of any political issue. For her, she was trying to speak for what she saw as many conservatives who are kind of confounded that their relatives who are more liberal are radicalized into thinking that anything is more important than family, that any political disagreement is worth burning a bridge about. And so that was interesting, because I then tried to represent the many conversations I've had with people for whom politics is a lot more than just something I have an opinion about. It's who I am. Like, something about it is deep in my heart. So where do you decide when that's not worth doing anymore? In the course of a conversation, the most specific I can get, and this is very abstract, is heat in a conversation is okay. The difference is whether it's cooking something or burning something. And only you know the difference. You know if trust is being burned. You know if your relationship is being burned beyond what you want. You know if your own sense of self-worth and self-respect is being burned, right? You often don't know that until you're in the conversation. So that's where courage comes in. If you're willing to put yourself in that position, that's, again, up to you. But you just can't predict it, right? Another thing is, and I talk about this in the SOS, and this does figure into it. It's tricky to talk about. But there's a lot of research that's showing that across the political divide, there is an incredible amount of exaggeration, that we see more extreme beliefs than there actually are. And so there's been lots of studies that have shown this. So I say that not to say we're all wrong and everyone we think is evil and threatening to us really isn't. But it's to say that because we know it's happening, can that make us a little more humble? So where we think, that person believes X, and so they're definitely going to hate me, coming into that conversation. Can we make that into a question mark? Are they? Is it maybe there's something else. Maybe there's trust already there. Maybe I'm already in relationship with that person. Maybe there's a way I can try to understand where they're coming from, and maybe I'll find a variable that is not just hate or something ugly. And there's so many circumstances where people have found that, and we can go into those examples. But it's enough that I hope will at least introduce curiosity, at least introduce uncertainty, because the more of us opt out of those conversations, the more of us put ourselves out of sight. And when we're out of sight, we're not seen, right? And so the more that different groups of people do that, I don't know how we hold it together.
I'll add for those of you who have yet to read the book that as you do, you will be challenged to dive in to conversation and to really explore. That's the actionable piece. So good luck.
Yeah.
I wonder, because it's such an important part of the book, whether you could take a little time to talk about your experiences bringing together residents of King County and residents of Sherman County. This is a largely urban and a rural county in the state of Washington where you live, and bringing them then together for conversation, discourse about politics and values and whatnot.
So after the 2016 election, I had started a newsletter called The Evergrey in Seattle. And among our core values were curiosity and openness and inclusiveness. And so we realized pretty quickly that a lot of people in our community after that election, Seattle very, very blue, very democratic, very dead on November 9th. I mean, no one knew how to, it was just rough. People wrote us and said, I want to be curious, but I don't have anyone to be curious with. I don't know any Republicans, any conservatives. I'm not sure who to ask. But there was that initial sort of novelty, the shock for many liberals meant people wanted to know. And so we ended up discovering this interactive map that showed for whatever county you lived in the United States, you plugged it in and it would show you the county nearest to yours geographically that voted exactly opposite in the presidential election. That turned out to be Sherman County, Oregon, a county of about 2,000 people, second smallest county in the state, almost entirely wheat farmers. And we're like, wow, never heard of it? Let's give them a call. And so one thing led to another, and I remember being really kind of terrified, finding the number of this woman who wrote this community newsletter for Sherman County. She was in her 80s, and just getting on the phone with her and just stammering out this idea, like, I don't know, maybe like we could do a visit. I don't know, like maybe there's a way we could talk it out. I don't know. And she was like, I think that's a delightful idea. And I remember the way she said it, and I was like, okay, this is good. I don't sound like a crazy person. We ended up partnering with the longtime agricultural agent who's now a close friend, Sandy McNabb, and he was just amazing and really, really partnering. We organized this trip. Folks from King County would come down. There was a bus tour of the wheat fields. There was a meal that we would share that they donated. We would talk about everything other than politics, and then we would talk about politics, because that's the way to do it. And we showed up with a housewarming gift, too. It's like they're welcoming us. Nobody from Seattle or any city ever goes to Sherman County. And they knew that, and anyway, that's another story. But it was a remarkable experience, and in designing the structure of those conversations, me and my co-founder ran into, we're journalists, we're careful, we're not gonna be biased here. And I'll never forget Sandy on the phone, we had drafted, some questions, and he goes, so we're asking these questions about, what are you afraid of or what do you hope for over the next 4 years? He's like, you don't think Trump's gonna get reelected? Why are we saying 4 years? And I was like, good point, Sandy, good point. We changed that to like few years, just keep it ambiguous. But it was all these ways of making, we sort of knew that the second that it felt like this was made for one side or the other, the whole point of it would be lost. But yeah, on the bus ride back, it was a 5-hour bus ride. Nobody could hear themselves think. It's just everything we had learned. And I could say a lot more, but yeah, one of the things that I think about and concerned about is that trip and what we did in the months after the election feels near impossible in some communities today. I don't know if that would have worked. The trenches have gotten so much deeper.
Can you talk a little bit more about your work with the Bravery Angels and how, things like that, with bringing the two counties together, how that influenced you to start working there? And I'm not sure if people are familiar with the Bravery Angels, so if you could explain that a little bit too, that'd be great.
So Bravery Angels is the thing that I thought was impossible until I saw it. And I was like, I gotta be part of this, this is amazing. So it started also after the 2016 election. A lot of big experiments in that era. And it was co-founded by a renowned marriage therapist, Bill Doherty, out of the University of Minnesota, who's fantastic. And he just saw this parallel, that he's working with couples on the brink of divorce, and he's looking at Republicans and Democrats going, it's the same thing. Except that in America, at least we can't get divorced, right? That's not an option. So what do we do? So he designed these workshops, and it started, subtle, just one or two. There was a bus tour around the country, and they stopped, and the beginning of Braver Angels chapters started. Now we have about 50 offerings in the form of different workshops. Our signature workshop is what's called the Red Blue workshop, which is game-changing. I took it before I worked at Braver Angels. My parents took it, and I got to watch them go through it. But you are, in a group of conservatives or liberals, and you're talking with the other side, but you get taken through this extraordinary exercise. One of the most fascinating is the Stereotypes Exercise. You are in a room, if you're a liberal, you're in a room with liberals, conservative room with conservatives, and you write the stereotypes that the other side has about you. And you do that for a good while, and you really dig in. And then the next step is to say, what are the kernels of truth to those stereotypes? That's really cool. And then the next step is, what corrections would I make to those stereotypes? And then the groups come together. Each side gets to witness the other in extreme humility toward their own positions. And it just cracks open what seems possible. I've learned so much from those workshops. So there's about, 85 chapters across the country. There's one here in Maine. And there's the New England Super Alliance, which is really awesome. It's a really good one in Seattle as well. But each chapter of Braver Angels has to have 50% liberal-leaning and 50% conservative-leaning leadership. So basically the thing that feels impossible in the United States, Braver Angels is doing at the grassroots level. It's not easy by any stretch, but it is doable. And it's giving me a ton of hope. And the most recent thing that Braver Angels is doing is something called Braver Politics. We're bringing our workshops into the halls of power. We've done it with members of the Problem Solvers Caucus in Congress. One person I heard burst into tears. There's things you can learn when you start asking different questions about those who disagree with you, where they come from, who they are as people, and it opens up a lot of creativity and collaboration.
Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if it's time for us to open this conversation up to everybody in the room. And so we've got lots of time for questions and observations and challenges and your own experiences. We have microphones down both aisles. And again, if you want to go to the microphone, it's yours. Or if you want to raise your hand, we'll bring a microphone to you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But we want to hear from you, too. So have at it.
Hi. Mm-hmm. Oh, is it on? There we go.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I like the points you made, and one of the things that you touched on it a little bit about people with power and stuff like that. And I feel like in America, there's some few individuals that are so powerful that if they wake up one day and they say that they should move from east to west, the wind will move from east to west. Like that's how powerful they are. And I feel like a lot of these conversations are not being had with those kinds of people that can actually sit up, stand up, and be beacons of change and stuff like that. And so I'm wondering what are some suggestions that you could have that could pave the way to open conversation with those people so that you can have these kinds of change from the top down?
Yeah, oh, what a great question. People with a lot of power and influence fall into many camps, and not all have the greatest motivations, right? So I guess the reason I think of that is my friend Amanda Ripley, who wrote a book called High Conflict, incredible book, but she talks about conflict entrepreneurs. There's people who get a lot of power from dividing us, and that's the way that they climb, their power. That's the way that they get their status. That's the way they are who they are. And the only solution is to marginalize them, marginalize the conflict entrepreneurs. That's that group. There are a pretty healthy number of powerful individuals who see this problem and know that there is a way through that's worth trying, right? What's really annoying is that, I can't tell you guys how frustrating this is. I have talked to so many politicians, again, Congress, state legislatures, you name it, someone really high-ranking in Washington State just last week, and behind closed doors, they're able to say, I hate my job, I can't govern, this sucks. Like, you guys are working on something important, and I've also talked to this organization and that organization, and I want to help, and what can we do? The thing is, they can't come out front and say it. They're not getting rewarded enough. And their rivals, who are the dividers, are the ones getting the rewards. They'll be primaried out if they risk alienating their most active base in such a polarized time. So it's, man, do I feel for them, because I don't know, I don't have the solution, so all I can do is be in those behind the scenes conversations and encourage them and tell them, like, yes, we can help train your staff, or like, why don't we try this or that, let's do a forum. We're working on something called candidate debates that are just a completely different structure for candidate debates and elections. Like, so much of it is about institutional forces. And so it is that give and take, right? And this is a debate in sociology forever. Like, what changes first, the people or the institutions? So I think a lot of those people in power, here's the irony for me is they are so powerful, and yet they seem to just throw up their hands and be so powerless to change the dynamics that they feel trapped by. So it's giving me this really interesting lens on, wow, I thought this person was really powerful, but they're acting to me like they have no choice but to go along with the way the game is played. So that annoys me. And that's where I suppose, my solution, which is the one-to-one, it's necessary but not sufficient. There's also institutional change that has to happen. What I'm hoping is that there is kind of a tipping point where in this whisper campaign going on, it's so many whispers that it's basically a shout. That's what I'm hoping. I wish I had a more satisfying answer for you. But make it rewarding when you see your politicians or your leaders acting with inquiry, and reaching out and trying to do this a different way. We've got to show them that we actually notice and that we know it's good somehow.
Monica, your response is mostly focused on political power. Mm-hmm. What about corporate power, commercial power, or even cultural power? So unelected power, yep, but still very, very powerful.
That one's really tough. I think about that a lot in terms of media. I've been in media long enough to know it's a survivor's game. And it's really easy to kind of sit on the outside and be like, oh, they want is clicks. And it's like, they don't survive without them, It's really, really tough without geographic bounds to give media kind of roots in their own community, and that's everywhere they need to appeal. Now it's anybody's game, and we've spent 20 years in this climate. It's just rough, and the easiest way to get the attention that you need to survive in media and in the commerce of media, the commerce of information, is emotion. And so, wow, like journalists, I did this too. I can write a headline that will make you click. I can write a headline that will make you mad. And I don't like knowing that I can do that and that I've learned, by sort of experimenting on so many thousands of people over the years. But this is where commerce has led us, to where it's about attention, and that's the way we win. So I do know that there are a lot of people working to try to figure out a better way. I ultimately have sort of, some faith in the market that it will eventually, hopefully, pick out the winner here. I think we need a lot more creativity and a lot more innovation. I don't think that we've really pulled the rabbit out of the hat here yet.
Hello?
Hey.
Okay. You talked a lot about how you've done grassroots work, and I think it's incredible and it's really inspirational, the stuff that you can do. My question sort of revolves around the idea of moving up to a larger audience without losing some of the personability that you have as a grassroots organization. Being able to get to know people and doing things with small groups, it can be very intimate.
Yeah.
I feel like you lose a lot of that when you try to move to a larger scene. A lot of social movements sort of stay at the grassroots level because if they go too large, a lot of voices are lost. How do you think we can combat that and sort of take things from this small grassroots level to a more national level?
Oh, I love that you brought that up, because Braver Angels is thinking a lot about that for precisely the reasons you mean. Our offerings, the experiences people have to be experiences. This is not something you can just kind of talk someone into. They have to see it to believe it, right? Especially if someone holds a lot of judgments about the other side. It's like being in that space where they go, oh, that's really thoughtful and came from a surprising place. People need to experience it. So that's precisely it. How do you scale those experiences? But then on the other hand, if it's all on the grassroots, how does that bust through the mainstream? I mean, so far, the signs of hope is that there's a lot of national media attention on this right now. In fact, yesterday, Braver Angels was a feature on CBS Sunday Morning, which was really cool. But like, where will that really bust into the mainstream? I'm honestly not sure, but I know that it's necessary. I think some of the things giving me hope too, though, are that there are some things that can scale. So, and a lot of it, I think, is the process and the practice. So, you know, how can we prove? I think this is kind of fun to think about. Like, what can we prove that the more inquiry-centric way of having a conversation is also more entertaining? Because it is. Like, how can you prove that? How can you show that? Right now, nobody seems to be picking that up, but I think you can. Like, I think that could be really interesting. So I think someone just needs to try it, which is why I'm saying that there's sort of room for creativity and innovation. And yeah, I mean, it's riveting when I watch it. It's just still kind of small because it's being done by this community of practice that's at the grassroots level. So I think there's a real opportunity for elevation here, but the resources aren't there just yet. So I'm hoping that will help. And that's not as satisfying of an answer as I wanted to give you. So maybe I'll think more on that. Thank you.
Hi. I guess following in your footsteps of like sharing stories, I'm also like Alondra from the South. I'm from Georgia, and I'm a Southern liberal, I guess you could say. And I guess where I find myself struggling or internally wanting to push back against the one-on-one idea is because of the state of geographic isolation which a lot of the country is in, especially this north-south divide. Being in New England, I find myself often overhearing or actively hearing, lots of stereotypes about the South. Yeah. And Georgia as a political state has not really been much interest until the recent governor race of, was it 2018?
That's right, yeah.
And so I guess, in what ways do you think like there are limits to your framework? And in what ways do you want to extend your framework to kind of consider this isolation, which is hard to bring together people from Maine and people from Georgia, just travel limits, obviously, but yeah. Even social media, it's hard to connect people one-on-one that ways. And so and then that doesn't even consider the West Coast and the Midwest. And so in what ways do you think being such a big state and such a divided state physically, divided nation country. Physically, how do you think like your framework can move to bring together people like across different regions of the United States?
No, I think it's absolutely a limitation. You're 100% spot on. I mean, the more sorted we get, the more that one-on-one conversations, which are the proximate conversations, become less and less interesting, or at least the divides they can cross just aren't that big. I think about in Sherman County, I remember Sandy and some of his friends telling me, longingly about how when they were kids, they had this incredible exchange program with the city of Portland. And there would always be students from Portland who would come and spend days or weeks on the farm. And that's just what they did. And so it felt like there was this sense in which the lifestyles were experienced, not just read about or labeled or stereotyped, which is what's happening now. I think we've dropped a lot of those programs. I would bring them back. It's funny to think about we need an exchange program within the United States. Yes, we do. We really, really do. I think that that's really powerful and can be so interesting. The other thing is, this is the time of year where at Braver Angels and in my own work, it's like, Thanksgiving's coming up, right? All the news stories want to know, like, what do you have to say about Thanksgiving? Well, it's interesting because oftentimes, in America, families don't tend to stay close geographically. We tend to move apart, right? So Thanksgiving and those moments where families come back together are becoming one of our most critical opportunities to take advantage of the fact that you do have different lifestyles connected by some relationship. And so it becomes all the more important, right? So when people say we just don't talk about politics, we're not going to bring it up, that's more and more people's only opportunity. So what can we do to get better at being aware that that's actually holding our democracy together is Thanksgiving, For those families who do have people in different parts of the country, anyone with different experience, it's taking advantage of any place where you have any ties with someone who's different. Or having the courage to create those ties to begin with, or to go to that place that's a little bit different. But I completely concede your point. It is harder and harder to do one-on-one. And this is where virtual can be pretty interesting. Like the Red Blue workshops I've done with Braver Angels had people from Texas and Florida and Alabama and everywhere. So virtual can sometimes crack that open, especially on the rural-urban divide. That's been really cool. It's really hard to get that divide in person.
Monica, do you foresee that the demographic shifts, people moving around, remote work opportunities, or rethinking careers and re-inhabiting, so people with urban backgrounds re-inhabiting more rural spaces is going to mix this country in any meaningful way?
I was hopeful about that. I have a friend who moved to the Mathau Valley in Washington, which is a rural area. And she talked about how, she's just an very openly curious person and talking to a lot of folks. And she talked about how there's now kind of a slur for the urbanites who move in, and they're called, modem cowboys. That all they want is good Wi-Fi. And that's it, that they're not investing in the community, they don't really want to know, and they kind of walk around with stereotypes about who people are and what they believe, and they're not really interacting. So that said, I still think largely there's a lot of organic, spontaneous interactions that happen, that don't result in anecdotes like that get shared around and then roll eyes. It's like, I hope it does help because it's at least something, right? People are kind of, in a weird way, rediscovering rural, but they're still not actually talking to people. And that's the thing that gets me, is like, we will come up with any reason not to talk to each other across these differences. We're scared, and it makes some sense, but it also doesn't.
All you. You want? Okay. Hi. So to the Australian point, I thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah.
This is like really long-winded context, like for the question. But I'm very openly curious, and I would consider myself pretty non-judgmental-ish, like a self-aware level. How do you persuade, or how can you persuade others to be comfortable with having uncomfortable conversation? I guess you could think of it on like a political level, but also like a conversational, like just general level, without like pushing the envelope a little too much to where it's like tasteless, but then also like appropriately challenging them.
Yeah, that's a great question. Appropriately challenging them. That's a good way to put it. It comes back to that principle of people only hear when they're heard. And you can't control when someone else feels heard enough to then hear, or to be in that exploratory discovery type of mode where you can go to some really interesting places with them. A lot of people walk into these conversations extraordinarily insecure from all sides. Either they're worried about their relationship, with you or with whoever they think they belong with. They might worry that like a Pandora's box will talk about something and then some evil spirits will come out and then what will happen to me? There's a lot. There's that idea of threatening of an identity. So what I think of is, I think it's about time. It's about making sure that the pace is something both people can keep up with. I wonder if I'm like you. The mistake I make is moving too quickly. Because I've researched this stuff. I tend to come in with a lot of security, and I tend to overlook the fact that not everyone may be there, with me. And so I want people to just let's go, let's explore abortion. It's like, explore abortion. What are you talking about, right? So if I get carried away, that's how I make the mistake. So it's about slowing way down and asking way more questions than giving answers, because it is that piece that matters most is. Let me put it this way. Like, as a journalist, I have seen firsthand how much people love to talk about themselves when they know that they're being heard in a generous light. We love that. It's awesome. Like, not that long ago, I was in this ordinary moment, right, where I'm having, I'm meeting somebody, and we kind of have something to do. There's a reason we're meeting. We have this thing to do. And so things have happened in my life that have been really interesting, but I go, I'm not going to talk about it. She doesn't care. We just need to get to work, right? And so she asks me a question, and I answer a little bit about what I did, right? And then she goes, wow, that must have been really cool. Tell me more. So I say a little more. And then, I'm like, wow, this person actually cares about me. It's not just that they're curious. Curiosity is a form of caring. They care about me. And so what a gift interest is. So when we want to have political conversations, I think our mistake is to just go straight into that. But it's like, you're not really interacting with an idea. You're interacting with a person. So how do you care for that person? So that that person feels like, this could be interesting. This might even be fun. This could be illuminating. What would that look like? What kind of context can you put around? And there's lots of tactics to talk about in your words, in your language, in your tone, in your gesture, and in the fact that the most important thing to do in a conversation really is to make sure you can have another one. Like preserve the ability to talk about this again, and the conversation never really ended, and you can just continue and continue. A lot of us just don't think about how much time trust takes.
I made it. No, it was good because I was sitting there thinking about how many of the questions which question I should pick, which was most relatable to mine, and I was like, pretty much all of them have been. So,
Sweet.
I guess my question is, I think at institutions, kind of at a larger, maybe college universities or just even small ones too. I guess I sort of feel like there's I guess we were talking about institutions earlier, there's a clear tie between what an institution feels politically. I feel like most institutions are pretty liberal. That's not very hidden.
Yeah.
And I guess I just wonder, kind of what you're talking about, how do you do that at a college context level? How do you listen to someone who's not liberal? Because it's there's a real cancel culture for sure that totally exists, but also the administration, or at an administrative level, it's things are on one side. So it's how do you exist in that? And two, do you think institutions should be doing that? I guess is another question, but independent of whether you're liberal or not.
Right.
Because I'm sure there's a few conservative universities too, obviously.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, that's the big one. That's the big one at colleges. I mean, honestly, I think there's a real big hill to climb on this. As far as should colleges be doing this? Yes. I mean, if colleges are the place of learning, and within colleges people don't feel comfortable sharing what they really think, that's a problem. Now, I'm not saying sharing what they really think if it's evil or terrible. No, that's not what I mean. But being conservative is not being evil or terrible, right? But let's be honest, I think there's a lot of contexts and institutions where it almost feels like it's believed that it is. So the first thing is, what do you do to make it okay for someone to even admit that they might hold a more conservative idea? And that's hard enough in some of these contexts. So that's the first thing. I think that a lot comes from leadership, but that today, and I've talked with a lot of teachers at high schools and professors in colleges, and where they're not even sure that, even though they're in positions of leadership, they're not sure how to lead into that climate. They're afraid that there's too much in the way, or that many students would resist for a lot of reasons that they feel are just really, really important and would be really tricky. So I don't know. One of the things that gives me hope, that's going to sound coming out of left field, but I feel like we're going through a really important adolescence as a society. Meaning, we've just learned some, not even learned, but surfaced for all to see, extraordinary lessons about different people, different groups of people, race, gender, sexuality, you name it. It's been this revolution of sight, right? Of those who have felt very powerless, finding their way into, seat at the table and all of that. And so I think we're going through this, okay, so we've gotten that, and here it comes, and it's awkward right now. It's awkward. And so the way that in adolescence, people often lash out, and you don't understand me, and you don't understand me, and everything, breaks, and you don't talk to your parents for days, and institutions, the household crumbles, and I thought you loved me, and all of that is happening right now. So what's giving me hope is that the lessons are good and clear, and I think that ideological and viewpoint diversity is really important, but because there's this deep impression due to a lot of, I think, the SOS and the exaggerations, that it stands against some of these lessons. There's a particular kind of closed door and a clamping on that particular type of inclusion. But I think as we build more security individually and institutionally, we'll begin to see the nuance in that and get curious and see the complexity in it and go like, no, man, like ideological diversity is so important. It keeps us from going too far. Like whatever side you're on, if we don't mix this American experiment is over. And if we can't do it at institutions of learning, of all places, you know, so this is where it's hardest maybe, but this is also where it's most critical. And I'm really hopeful because at the classroom level, right, Bowdoin students, it's like, there's some classes here that are 8 students, 9 students, 10 students, you know, it's like, we can lean into that. We can say, oh, okay, you're pro-life, interesting. Tell me more about that, you know, or like, whatever. If we can build a campus where that's okay to say what you really truly believe, how can it enrich everyone else's perspectives? And the climate as a whole, I think, is really, really exciting and totally possible.
Hi. Okay. So I'm Dominican, and like my older sister, I came to the U.S. for my studies, and so we often have conversations with our parents specifically about racism, homophobia, sexuality, and it all does revolve like U.S. politics, and there's often a huge divide in that, like we've been gringified or Americanized, and like I do think those issues are something that are also prevalent in our culture and worldwide, and so I wonder if you have any insights on how to bridge that like international gap, or not even, but how do you kind of face that issue?
Yeah, because you're talking about a divide and then another divide, you know, it's like onion layers of divides, but the international thing is fascinating. I see that with my Mexican family too.
Yeah.
With those, it's you know, it comes back to time again. It's like, it's really hard to unpack nuance to someone who hasn't experienced your culture and how it sort of sits there. And to see across cultures is really tough. I think one of the most important things to have in your tool belt is stories. So if you can say, you know, so, you know, my aunt or whatever, who's Dominican and doesn't quite see it this way, if instead of just presenting the argument, but it's like this, but it's like this, you can say, you know, I was at Bowdoin and this thing happened and this student, you know, shared this experience, or, you know, I heard from this person about this and this. If you can lay it out in a narrative, then they can follow start to finish and they can track the emotion and the struggle and the pain, and that transcends culture. It really, really does. I don't think that we employ stories as much as we should, because it has that power. We don't often sort of remember them, right, and have them sort of at the ready, but I think for issues we really care about, it can be really useful to start collecting those in a way, right? The stories that gave you that aha moment, can you tell that story to somebody else? It's not going to give them the aha moment, but it'll help them understand why you see it this way. And then they may come back with a story about, well, in the Dominican Republic, here's why I see it differently, and let me tell you a story that I haven't thought about for years about why it looks so different to me. And so then somehow at the intersection of those stories, you'll be able to see a lot more clearly where the differences really are, and they may not be as big as you think. And so you might be able to say, well, oh yeah, that kind of sounds a lot like what I was saying. Oh, I suppose it does. Yeah, okay, sure. And then you're able to get past, because that's the other thing is we'll tell ourselves, well, this is too different. She believes this different thing. There's nothing we share in common. But when you start telling stories, you start to see that that's not true. You can get past that.
I have like a flip book of questions, so it's like overwhelming. But thanks so much for being here.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how you describe yourself politically, like how, because obviously our world like depends on labels, like how we portray ourselves, and obviously it would be best if we had like years to have conversations with everyone and build
relationships based on experiences, shared experiences, but we can't because you only have a certain amount of social energy and time. And so I'm wondering how you kind of most accurately like portray who you are and how you are politically, because we all have to do that.
Yeah, oh, it's interesting. I haven't been called to do it that often. I know that I am blue. Every now and then I'll take an online quiz, because there's so many. I was like, okay, where are my politics now? And I seem to be on the more moderate side of liberal, so not as far left. So yeah, it seems like that's where I am. But yeah, like if I were to give my own labels to things, I've been thinking about this as like anti-partisan. Feels like it describes me pretty well. Like I have a real, and this goes all the way back to high school or even before middle school, where like all the girls at the cafeteria table around me would all stand up at the same time and go to the bathroom together. And I just didn't, even if I had to go to the bathroom. You know, like I'm not going. So I think there's just something about me that's like, if there's a group, I don't know, I feel like I might lose myself being part of that group. So that's just something that's in me and probably led me to some of the work I'm in. But yeah, I have kind of an allergy to that, right? Which is not to say that I'm not part of communities that swirl around me, right? So I consider myself a part of, I think of it that way, like what communities am I a part of? And I'm a part of this like burgeoning, swirling community of bridge builders who for all different kinds of reasons, you know, we do the work that we do. Yeah, but as much as possible, I try to avoid having to explain my politics as a label. And I just try to, if we're talking about an issue, I'll try to find a way to honestly say what I believe, if it's appropriate.
Hi. Hi. I had a question. Sorry. I feel like I really related to your idea of like being in the silo and how everyone kind of exists in their own. And I feel like especially being at Bowdoin, we can all, or a lot of us can relate to this idea of being in a Bowdoin bubble and kind of being so caught up in your work and your school and your social life that you don't even have time to like, consider politics or what's going on outside of Bowdoin. So do you have any advice for those of us who wish to kind of diversify our like news sources and media, and like how do we get a broad, like diverse, source, list of sources from which to like get our news or get our stories or like kind of escape this bubble and also escape our own silos?
Yeah, I mean, you know, to the first point, a lot of us are really busy, and we're not going to make a whole hobby out of, you know, spending a lot of time. It's more practically about the relationships you do have and the disagreements you do see. Can you cross some of these short bridges? Can you ask another question where you would have just given your opinion? Can you be more curious in that moment? But more practically and tactically on how to find different sources. I'll just name a couple that have been praised by a lot of folks in my world. The Christian Science Monitor is really good at very curious political coverage. I know their senior congressional correspondent, she's a friend. They've worked really, really hard on that, so that's sort of surprising and kind of fun. There are news sites or news aggregators that are focused on pulling together what's coming from the left and the right and the center so that you can see it all together. And my favorite of those is All Sides. So yeah, there's a media source called All Sides. Their Instagram account is fantastic. And yeah, it can be a little challenging depending on what side you're on, but they do really good analysis of the left is focusing on this, the right is focusing on that, and the center seems to be here. You know, and it keeps you from falling into traps like when you just read one side of it, because our realities are so splintered, our language is becoming splintered. So one thing I've noticed is that if you tend to just read news just on the one side, your vocabulary will begin to adopt terms that are actually really charged and loaded for the other side of the political divide, and you won't even know it. So when you have a conversation with someone who is on the other side, you'll use those terms like it's totally fine, and it'll feel like a slap in the face to them. And if you don't have a diverse enough news diet, you won't even know that vocabulary is like, how you name or frame an issue is such a political act, and one that a lot of journalists just kind of leave to the ideology of wherever their audience tends to lean, and that's a problem.
Hi. I'll make a shameless plug for mediatrades.org, developed by a behavioral economist here. And there are currently 6 left-leaning articles awaiting trades for any conservatives out there who
Oh,
want to
interesting.
trade an article.
Wow.
Basically, you submit an article from the left with a reader, and with a reader on the right, and you summarize their article first without giving your opinion, and only then, when you've done like a paragraph objective as possible summary, do you then give your opinion on your opponent's article.
Whoa.
And he even did it with right-leaning students from Clemson University trading articles with left-leaning students from Bowdoin, which was really cool.
That's fascinating.
But related to that, highly recommend you go to Dog Bar Gym tomorrow, the coffee shop on Union Street. Okay. I'm always talking about this stuff with Ben there, who trained in Seattle, and he said, well, anti-polarization is polarizing. So that's something to bring up with him. He finds the depolarization movement to be polarizing. So how do we avoid becoming like our own echo chamber within anti-polarization? Maybe? I don't know.
Wait, how?
That's like purple. You're wearing the purples. You know, we want to get away from red and blue.
I guess I am.
we want to get away from red and blue, but how do we keep purple from being polarizing, becoming its own? I think sometimes when I'm trying to depolarize friends, I shame them about their polarized views.
Yeah, this is a big misconception about depolarization, at least the kind that I champion. It's not about bringing everyone to the middle. It's not about centrism, and it's not about saying that, you know, the beliefs on the partisan left or partisan right are not worth holding at all. It's about temperament, and it's about holding up the foundation on which any of these political sides or opinions can be in useful conversation with each other. That's all it is. So I think it's really unfortunate that, and I think the movement's made some mistakes, you know, to characterize it that way. In fact, like at Braver Angels, we get a lot of flack for focusing so much on red and blue because people who really are purple, or a popular term now is politically homeless, say, no, I mean, it's actually a really popular term with a lot of people. You know, they go, is this for me? And we're like, yes, it is. It is. We're focused on the red and blue because that's the binary that's tearing us apart, not because we think that everybody fits there or needs to. But yeah, it really is a movement about temperament. So I think that's the thing. It's like coming back and underlining it and bolding it and like circling it with Sharpie that this is, if depolarization is about letting go of your convictions, it's a complete fail. That cannot be what it is. If it's about, let's make it all lukewarm so we can get along. No, it's about putting a container to these passions where they can be heard, right? Because right now, the passions just, they can't. They sound offensive or like blabbing, you know, to people who might otherwise be persuaded if our climate weren't what it is, you know? So that's it. It's like my main interest is persuasion would be great. Persuasion is effective, but we can't do it with this amount of fracture. Like the mirror is shattered on the ground. It's in pieces, right? So that's it. It's like, it's not get curious so you can ask questions for the rest of your life, right? And just like, oh, now I understand you. Next. Now I understand you. Next. No. It's, okay, I understand this. This is what I believe to be true. I'm going to learn from the other side. It's going to enrich my perspective. But I believe that this is an urgent issue, and I'm going to go act. It's not about calming down action either. I'm going to go act. I'm going to go fight for this, but I'm going to do it more wisely. And then we all kind of do that, and then persuasion becomes possible because we're also talking to each other in a way that doesn't dehumanize, right? Doesn't make the other person run away screaming. And so now that person can actually hear what we're trying to say. And then persuasion is possible again. So that's my main worry is like, democracy doesn't work if persuasion doesn't have space, you know, and channels to move. And that's really the lethal thing right now.
Tom, I think we're ready with.
Sure. Can I ask a quick one? Really quick.
Yeah.
Come to the microphone because then it'll be recorded.
We want you on
forever.
the record. Right.
I don't mean to hold people here, but I see so many members of the Brunswick community in attendance, and one thing, expanding off Tara's question, is that we hear a lot about like the Bowdoin bubble, being that the Bowdoin student community is very separated from the Brunswick community more largely. And I'm wondering, Monica, like in your experience as a Bowdoin student, in your time here, do you think that's like largely a product of COVID, or do you think that's more an overarching thing? And how do you think we can bridge that gap, perhaps like through a dialogue with the people?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great opportunity, right? You're all in the same room. When I was at Bowdoin, I also heard that critique. And it's tough, and there's also different kinds of divides. I've just become an advisor to a really fascinating project called Generations Over Dinner. Look it up, generationsoverdinner.com. And the goal is how many of the 7 living generations can you put around a table all at once for a dinner? So cool. And I was at the Seattle launch dinner, had 5 of the 7 living generations. So our oldest member was 89, our youngest was 13. And we just had conversations about life and everything. So yeah, there's generational divides, there's divides as far as your experience. A lot of Bowdoin students are not from Brunswick, they're not from Maine. Yeah, but it is the interaction. You have so much to learn from each other. And yeah, I think there's this temptation to come together in rooms like this, sort of hear a lecture and then go home. But my favorite part of things like this is the after conversations, And so I think there's something about, well, I don't know, what if several of you were just like, I'm just going to linger for a little bit. Let's see what happens. And I'm going to look around and say hi to somebody. See what happens. Is it about the pandemic? Yeah, I mean, for sure. A lot of people got used to it. I mean, back in Seattle, I'm like, I don't want to drive 10 minutes. Really? We've gotten pretty stupid about that. So yeah, hopefully we come back to remembering there's some real magic in co-presence and the amount of ties that we can build and ways that we can make everything better. So thanks for asking that. It's really cool.
I think that ties in wonderfully with sort of the end of our program. So I'm going to quickly respond to that question as well with 2 potential avenues here. First, if you want to continue this conversation, head on over to Mac House afterwards, and you can absolutely continue this conversation.
I forgot. And everyone from the community.
We've got a few Mac House people here. Maybe they can raise their hands. Steve's here. I think probably the rest of Mac is over there setting up. But you can follow Steve over. Mac is at the corner of McKean Street and Main Street, so he can lead you over there as well. The other thing I will pitch is for those of you who want to get more engaged with the community here, you have the McKean Center for the Common Good, and that is our purpose, whether that is doing community service work, whether that is learning about communities here in Maine or around the country through an alternative break trip, or if you want to have a dialogue, we have those too. We have our What Matters program. We've done a similar version to what you did in Washington, just up the road in Richmond. So with my friend Craig Freshley here. So there are lots of those opportunities there as well. So definitely please feel free to talk to myself, talk to Alondra, talk to Sarah, and we're happy to help you with those opportunities too. But with that, I want to thank Monica so much for joining us, and thank Alondra and Barry for leading such a great conversation.
Thank you.